Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Meeta Anand. I'm the Census 2020 Senior Fellow at the New York Immigration Coalition. In that role, I also serve as facilitator and convener of New York Counts 2020. We are here today to make sure that New York gets counted in the 2020 census. We all know that the Trump administration has enacted actions that has led to fear, misinformation, and confusion about the census. We are actively fighting these measures at the New York Immigration Coalition, including fighting the unlawful and unconstitutional exclusion policy memo where he stated undocumented immigrants are not counted for the purposes of apportionment. We also support all efforts to stop the shortening of the census. But in the meanwhile, we need to do everything we can to make sure that New Yorkers are counted by September 30th. As of yesterday, New York State was at 61.9% response rate compared to a national rate of above 65%. New York City was at 59.9%. And I'll let my fellow speakers talk about Brooklyn's rate. What we know is that New York is ranked currently number 34 in the nation, and as New Yorkers, we know that we should be number 1. So with that, I'm going to bring up Borough President Eric Adams to speak a bit more about the importance of the census. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. I really want to take our hats off to the Immigration Coalition, who just clearly understood from the beginning of this operation that we could not speak in silos if we wanted to get our message out in the various languages here in the city of New York in the borough of Brooklyn, where 47% of Brooklynites speak a language other than English at home. And so if we're only communicating with English speakers, we're going to miss 50% of the borough. And when you look at the numbers, we are at a 54% level. That is sending a chilling message that we need to empower organizations like the Immigration Coalition, as well as some of our local grassroots community-based organizations. That is how we're going to get this done. And I want to thank Pastor Monroe, who has been leading the initiative from Borough Hall, the Make Brooklyn Count initiative, where we've partnered with a number of groups. Now is the time to do the last dash for September 30th, empowering those pre-existing organizations that when they knock on someone's door, the person behind that door is not intimidated or afraid. The federal government, through some of the hate rhetoric, has done a successful job of intimidating local families on the ground. We need to counteract that intimidation, and there's no better way to do it than a face that has helped you with rent, that has helped you with food services, that has helped you navigate government. These are pre-existing relationships that we need to empower. We need the financial help from the state to get the money down on the granular level, those who are willing to go into the various communities and bring our numbers up. This is too important. Every 10 years, we were last 10 years ago. We don't want to be last again. That is why I join and raise my voice with these important organizations and this important coalition of saying we must make sure every Brooklynite counts, every Bronx night, every Queens, Manhattan, Staten Island, every New Yorker must count so we can get our proper resources in the upcoming years. Again, thank you for all participating in this important endeavor that impacts us in a real way. Let's make sure we count. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And as Borough President Adams said, everyone counts, and representing the great borough of Manhattan, we have Deputy Borough President Aldrin Rafael Bonilla to say a few remarks.
Thank you. I'm Aldrin Rafael Bonilla, Deputy Borough President of Manhattan, and I'm here for a very clear reason. Joining Brooklyn Borough President Eric Adams in the planet of Brooklyn. And I guess we're here to show love. It's the Brooklyn way, right? Show love is the Brooklyn way. And you couldn't show love more profoundly You cannot show love more publicly. You cannot show love more long-lasting than filling out your census. What you do today will impact your community, will impact law enforcement, will impact teachers, will impact grandparents, will impact caregivers for the next 10 years. Very seldom do you take an action where people will be affected for the next 10 years. So we're here to say it's very important. It's a sign of love. You must fill out your census. It's an obligation, it's a duty, it's a civic calling. It's something that will bring us all together, and it's something that we'll benefit from for the next 10 years. Now in Manhattan, as I'm sure in certain parts of Brooklyn, we have a unique challenge, and that a lot of people have relocated during COVID to secondary homes, perhaps in the Hamptons or Connecticut or in other areas. And they may have filled out their census elsewhere or may not have filled it out again at all. Our special call to these individuals who have relocated elsewhere is to fill out your census with your New York City primary residence address. It's very important. You'll be back to New York City. You love New York City. Your heart is here. Your home is here, and we expect you back. But we expect you back with those resources for the next 10 years that's related to the census. We'll recover from the pandemic of COVID, like we recovered from 9/11, like we recovered from the great financial crisis, like we recovered from Superstorm Sandy. But there's very little example of being able to recover from a huge undercount for the next 10 years. The consequences are dire. The stakes can't be any higher. We don't have an advocate in the White House. We have an individual that at every turn has made it more difficult instead of easier, has made the ability to disappear more frequent than ever. So we must not be disappeared. We must stand up. We must not be silent. We must speak out. But most importantly, we show love publicly the Brooklyn way by standing up, filling out your census, completing out your census. And if you've done it in a secondary address, do it with your home address of New York City, because we expect you back and we want to bounce back better and bigger than ever in New York City. Thank you so much.
Thank you. It is my great pleasure now to introduce Amit Bugga, who I've been working hand in hand with for over a year, working on New York City Census, and he is the Deputy Director of New York City Census. The hands were when we could hold hands.
We still proverbially hold hands every day. Thank you so much, Mita, for your tireless efforts, for your partnership, for your friendship. Thank you so much, Borough President Adams, for hosting us today. Thank you to all of our partners who we've all been working hand in hand with for months. As Mita mentioned, my name is Amit Singh Bugga, and I'm the Deputy Director of NYIC Census 2020, which is New York City's first ever citywide initiative to ensure that we have a complete and accurate count in the decennial census. We were founded last year under the leadership of Mayor Bill de Blasio and City Council Speaker Corey Johnson, and we are a $40 million investment to ensure that we have a complete and accurate count here in New York City. I'm here to talk to you today about a few numbers that we are seeing across the city and also here in Brooklyn, and also I'm going to touch on one very specific point that we want to make sure that all New Yorkers understand, particularly those who are residents of the Bronx, Queens, and Brooklyn. I myself am the proud son of the Bronx. I now live in Queens, and I had to get my passport stamped here on the BQE on my way down. Fortunately, they let me in. So, as my colleagues will tell you, and as Mita likes to say more so than ever, the census is really about money, power, and respect, and how we get our rightful share here in New York City. Here in New York City, we've been working very hard to ensure that Black, brown, and immigrant communities across the city are getting the money, power, and respect that are rightfully ours. We have some good news to share with you today, which is that here in Brooklyn, certain communities, historically African American and Afro-Caribbean communities that were significantly undercounted in past censuses, through the organizing that we have helped fund and that we have worked on, are now significantly surpassing their 2010 census response rates. In particular, I'd like to shout out Prospect Lefferts Gardens, which is now more than 11 percentage points ahead of where it was in 2010. Flatbush, which is 11 points ahead of where it was in 2010. Crown Heights, 9.4 percentage points ahead of where it was in 2010. Flatlands and Prospect Heights, both of which are about 5 and 2.5% ahead of where they were in 2010. Thank you. This does not happen by accident. This does not happen simply because. This happens because when New Yorkers come together, we educate, we organize, we mobilize, we get things done. That's the Brooklyn way. What we are seeing across the city, in neighborhoods in Brooklyn, Queens, and the Bronx, is that there has been great improvement, and we have about 21 days to go to keep pushing these numbers up. But as our dear friend Aldrin mentioned, we have a couple of New Yorkers who we know are still New Yorkers at heart, who are on their way back here soon, that still need to do their part. And that is true not only in Manhattan, but is true also here in Brooklyn. The neighborhood that we are in right now, Brooklyn Heights, back in 2010 had an initial self-response rate of about 75%. Today, that figure is only 64. Brooklyn Heights is 10.6 percentage points behind where it was in 2010. If you are a Brooklyn Heights resident, if you are a downtown Brooklyn resident, if you are a Cobble Hill resident that has temporarily relocated, and I don't care if you're in the Hamptons or if you're in Connecticut or if you're upstate or whether you're even in a different country, if you are still a New Yorker and you plan on being back in New York City, make sure to go to my2020census.gov right now, use your New York City address, your 11231 zip code, and fill out your census. There is no greater or simpler or easier task that you could do to demonstrate your pride as a New Yorker and to do your part on behalf of the city that you love and that you are still a part of. I'd also like to quickly draw attention to places in Brooklyn where we still need a lot of help. There are a couple of neighborhoods where we're not doing as well as we'd like. And we need as much attention paid to these neighborhoods, we need as much focus paid to these neighborhoods in the next 2.5 weeks as possible. In Cypress Hills, we have a self-response rate of just 44.4%. In Borough Park, 45.4%. In Mapleton, 45.6%. And in Manhattan Beach, 46.1%. Now, these neighborhoods are socioeconomically and demographically different from each other. They represent different groups, different languages. So what we know is that we have the ability to reach these folks. We have the ability, because we are New Yorkers, to communicate with our fellow New Yorkers in linguistically and culturally competent ways. And so we are asking you, if you are a member of any of these communities, you have friends or families, members who live in these communities, take 2 minutes and remind them to go online and complete the census. The census is easy, it is safe, it is important. There are absolutely no questions about immigration or citizenship, and your responses are protected by one of the strongest federal privacy laws that exists on the books. Now, with apologies for how long I've gone on, I just want to make one final point. We know that there are tens of thousands of New Yorkers, many of whom are undocumented immigrants, who are living in basement apartments in multifamily homes across the Bronx, Queens, and Brooklyn. Many of these basement apartments are legal. The large majority of them are not. We want to send a very clear and unequivocal message to both landlords and tenants. It is critical that if you are living in a basement unit that you fill out the census. You can use your full address to fill out the census and no harm will come to you. If you are a landlord, the information that's being filled out by your tenant does not come back to the Department of Buildings in the City of New York, cannot have access to that information and cannot use it to harm you in any way. If you are a tenant and you are concerned about your information being shared with your landlord or potentially with the immigration authorities, please know unequivocally, there's a law that was passed in 1953. It has not been broken ever since. Your information is safe. Your family is safe. Fill out the census now with complete information about everyone in your household and make sure you are counted. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Amit. I do want to clarify that if you are overseas, it is not possible to access the website, but you can call 844-330-2020 to fill out the census on the phone. It is now my distinct honor to introduce someone who I have heard talk about the census before I even got my job, and that's Public Advocate Jmani Williams.
Thank you, everyone, for being here. The Borough President, all of the organization, NYIC, and everyone else. We're at a critical moment, a critical juncture. So we need to get as much information out as humanly possible. As a son of immigrants, we want to make sure we get the message out to all immigrants, the importance of filling out the census. And this is me talking, I don't want to get anybody in trouble, but I know a lot of people don't like the occupant of the White House. And if you don't like the occupant of the White House, you can fill out the census. You should fill out the census. Before you go vote, fill out the census. The occupant of the White House has tried very hard to prevent immigrant populations from filling out the census. They have lost every single time. And so I know this was probably mentioned, but I'm proud of the work that we've done here in New York, the Attorney General, all over. They've lost. There is no questions about citizenship. ICE will not come at your door. Nothing to do with immigration will come out of this. The only thing it does is let us know that there's a human being that needs the services that human beings need. And so we're asking everyone, if you haven't, just go to the website, my2020census.org, gov.org, my2020census.gov. Actually, I think if you go to .org, it sends you to .gov also, but my2020census.gov, and fill it out. Anybody can fill out the census. You can fill it out for your parents. Anybody can fill out the census. And we have to make sure that everybody is counted. If someone is living on your sofa, if someone is living in your bathtub, I met matching people in basement apartments, everybody who's in that, anyone breathing in that household needs to be counted. And we talk about representation. We want to make sure you're represented in Congress. I'm sure some of these other things were talked about, but I want to repeat it, to get it where folks can grab it. Because people remember Elmhurst Hospital. They remember that it was overrun quickly when the COVID hit. And that is because Elmhurst Hospital's beds were based on the count 10 years ago. So 10 years ago, when less than 60% of New York City filled out the census, that's the only amount of beds that they had. And so even as immigrants, you need to go to the hospital sometimes. As immigrants, you want to put your child in a school. Those school seats are based on the census count. When you're trying to get housing assistance, those housing numbers are based on the census count. So if we're all going to go out and get the services we need, we have to make sure those services have adequately counted who we are and where we live. And the communities that have the hardest to count folks, from black men, black children, to all immigrants, undocumented, those are often the communities that need the most services. And so we are stuck here with needing the most services with people who are most afraid to fill out the census. And I'm also sure that this was said as well. I want to sympathize and empathize with those communities who are worried about government knocking on the door. Y'all are not crazy. There is a reason. Usually when government is knocking on black and brown or immigrant doors, not good things are happening. But believe us all who are here, this is not one of those times. This information is desperately needed and is some of the safest information that you can ever fill out on a government form. Please do not wait for people to knock on the door. If they've knocked on the door, it means we're too late and they're trying to get numbers that were missing. So please, everybody, they've made it to September 30th. They've cut it short in the hopes that you will be too afraid to fill this out. So we're begging, we're pleading, fill out the census. If you're hearing this, wherever you're hearing it, pull out your phone. Literally 5 minutes. I'm telling you, I did it on TV, took me 5 minutes, 3 people in my household. My2020census.gov. Peace and blessings, everyone. Thank you.
And next we're going to hear from Pastor Monroe, who is leading Brooklyn's Complete Count efforts.
Thank you. And I think I should leave this on for a minute. You like this? Yes. All right, make Brooklyn count. 100%. Make Brooklyn count. 100%. That's right, 100%. My message is really for all of the nonprofits organizations that we have been working with for the past year and a half who will not receive funding, whether it's state funding or city funding, that we want you to still work. It is imperative, because when you look at the resources that comes to nonprofit organizations, one of the things that we have to realize is also based on the census count. So I want to really encourage, as someone who have been leading Brooklyn with the nonprofit organizations throughout the last year and a half or 2 years, that we want to encourage you that don't feel discouraged, that you did not receive any funding. Really and truly do the best that you can. Use all the opportunities and all of the available events that you have to continue to spread the word. Get innovative, get creative, continue to go online, continue to also even go back to printing flyers to touch people where they are, in supermarkets, at restaurants, at soup kitchens, at pantries, wherever people congregate to do the type of work that needs to be done. So again, I want to encourage again all of my nonprofit colleagues, again, who did not receive the funding to do the work in all of those pockets that we talked about, Brooklyn being last in terms of counting and percentage, that you really do your best that you can, because the numbers 10 years later is going to reflect how much funding that we get as nonprofit organizations to do the work that we all want to get done. So I'm really encouraging, again, nonprofit leaders across Brooklyn. We believe that Brooklyn is going to win if all nonprofit organizations is engaged in the work. And so we want to lift you up, we want to highlight your work, we want to thank you in advance, and we want to continue struggling and keep on doing the work even though you don't have the funding. So thank you again, God bless everybody. Make Brooklyn count, 100%.
Thank you, Pastor. I'd next like to introduce my dear, lovely colleague at New York Immigration Coalition, Lovely Tejada.
Thank you. Can I get a round of applause for Mita, who has not only uplifted census efforts through, underfunding, but a pandemic, like through everything. She is like a superwoman. But I want to thank everybody who's here. I also want to kind of uplift what everybody has been saying, that all New Yorkers should be counted. We've been talking and spending a lot of time talking about the immigrant community, but let's also remember like the homeless populations. We're talking about children. We're talking about seniors. Everybody who is in New York needs to be counted. And let's spread this message to our friends, our family, and our neighbors, right? So one thing that I want to reiterate that has been spoken on this panel is that the census is safe and confidential. None of the information is going to be reported to ICE, to the Department of Homeland Security. That also goes to your landlord or to any agency, governmental agency, that makes any determination regarding public benefits. The other thing is that if you live in a illegal sublet, or if you are sharing a small space with more families or two families, please do not be afraid. The census is not asking you for reporting purposes. They just want to know how many people live in the home for counting purposes, so that we as a state can get our resources. This does not go to your landlords. If you can't vote, this is especially important now to fill out the census in the middle of a pandemic. This is how hospitals, schools, and libraries get their resources. So please, if you can't vote, complete the census. Since August, we have been seeing people on the ground from the Census Bureau go out into the communities to do the enumeration. What does that mean for our immigrant communities and for our communities at large? That means that if somebody comes knocking on your door, you should know and you should feel empowered to ask them for their identification. So if somebody comes knocking on your door, you should feel free to ask them to please provide their identification from the Census Bureau, and they should be able to provide that for you. Lastly, I want to just reiterate one last time that folks do have until September 30th to complete the census online, via phone, or by paper. And the website is my2020census.gov, and the phone number is 844-330-2020. Thank you, everyone. Oh, en español, okay. Todos los neoyorquinos de todos orígenes, sin importar su estatus inmigratorio, deben contarse. Esto incluye a los niños, la gente mayor, las personas sin hogar o indocumentadas. El censo es seguro, protegido y confidencial. No hay ninguna pregunta sobre la ciudadanía o estatus inmigratorio. Por ley, los datos de ninguna persona se pueden compartir con agencias del gobierno. Esto significa que no se puede compartir con el Departamento de Seguridad Nacional, no se puede compartir con el IRS o con agencias de vivienda o con los propietarios. Si vive en un subarrendamiento ilegal o comparte un espacio con varias familias, no deben de temer porque nada de esa información se comparte con ellos. Si no puede votar, en este momento esto es lo más importante, especialmente durante esta pandemia. Necesitamos que los fondos que son necesarios para las escuelas, para los hospitales y para las bibliotecas estén ahí para apoyar a los niños y para apoyar a sus comunidades. Desde agosto hemos visto que los hogares que no respondieron en línea comenzaron a recibir visitas de trabajadores del censo. Esto significa que ahora si viene alguien a tocar su puerta a visitarlo y dicen que son del censo, deben de sentirse seguros que pueden responder y darle la información por el propósito del censo. Y no es demasiado tarde de responder al censo ahorita. Tienen hasta el 30 de septiembre para llenarlo en línea, en papel o por teléfono. Entonces, en línea es my2020census.gov o por teléfono en español es 844-468-2020. Gracias.
Gracias, Lovely. We at the New York Immigration Coalition, as I've stated, have been fighting the Trump administration on its tactics of making us undercount our Black and brown and immigrant communities. But I want to emphasize that we are in full partnership with the Census Bureau in making sure that we get everyone counted. And with that, I want to introduce Lisa Moore from the Census Bureau, who will tell us a bit more about what to expect with the census enumerators or door knockers. Thank you.
Great. Woo-hoo. Thank you. Well, it's always so awesome to be with so many partners that speak the message 100%. So make Brooklyn count. Woo! Okay. But I just wanted to emphasize that it's not too late to respond. Respond now. And I do want to just call a sign to this. Stay strong, Brooklyn. We're in this together. Spread facts, not fear. Ties so well to the 2020 census. We are all in this together. We want to stay strong. The road to recovery, getting this accurate count will yield great dividends. And in order to do that, we're doing a couple different things right now. Since July 13th, we've launched our mobile questionnaire assistance program. So I have Lewis over there who's been kind of bouncing around asking people if they've completed the census. He has a tablet ready to go on the spot. We've hosted several events with trusted partners. And those partners are several hundred people coming into the community in food pantry lines to complete the census right then and there, and understanding how it ties to that service they're receiving. So really important that that program has been flourishing, and we have several hundred mobile questionnaires, we call MQAs, throughout the city every single day, which is really impressive. Then separately from that, we want to make sure everyone knows who is a census taker and make sure that everyone feels comfortable, and that confidentiality, I think, was so well said, where a census taker must wear their census ID. And you can ask them, and we encourage you to ask them because we want to avoid scams. So you should be asking them, can I see your census ID? And then begin to communicate with them. Sometimes they're coming back because there might be another address in the building that's not completed it, and they want to just ask additional information. So there's several reasons a census taker might come to your home, but just respond to them, cooperate with them so that they can go on their merry way and make sure that everyone is counted. But they will have a census badge, they'll have a lanyard, and they will have an iPhone device. And that will all be tied to the 2020 census and ensuring that they are counted. It's a mere moments of time that will yield great dividends in the future. And I think we've said it plenty here, but it's safe, easy, and important. We can't share that information that's collected with immigration. We can't share it with police. We can't share it with the landlord. We cannot share it with any other federal agencies. We can't share it with any other local, state, or local agencies. So the data that we collect is strictly confidential and cannot be shared or used against anyone. So really important to emphasize that, but I think to make Brooklyn count, 100%. We need to stay strong together and make sure that we're responding today to shape the future for the next 10 years. So thank you so much.
Next up, we're going to hear from some of our great community partners. I'm introducing Lurie Daniel Favors, the Interim Executive Director at the Center for Law and Social Justice at Medgar Evers College at CUNY. Lurie, that title, so long.
So long. We're going to make Brooklyn count. 100%. We're going to make Brooklyn count. 100%. Thank you so much for being here. I'm keeping my mask on because it is the time that it is. But I want to also hold up these posters because they really demonstrate two of the key populations that we are most concerned about. When we focus on New Yorkers of African descent, children under the age of 5 and men of African descent are among the least counted. Even though we have seen improvement over the past census cycle of 2010, the reality is if your schools are only funded at 60%, it is not enough. If our hospitals during a pandemic are only funded at 60%, it is not enough. If our transportation services during a pandemic are only funded at 60%, it is not enough. Communities of African descent have been historically undercounted. We have been historically invisible, and it is time that we show up, fill out the census for our babies, for our men, for our women, for our elders, for our transgender, for our non-binary, for everyone in our community. If you are focusing on small business, if you are focusing on education, all of the things that are going to be so vitally important after the pandemic, when we're talking about recovery from what COVID-19 has done to our communities, knowing that our communities have been ravaged by this virus, we have been devastated by its impact, our recovery is going to be funded based on census dollars. It is imperative that you visit my2020census.gov. Communities of African descent, be you African American, Afro-Caribbean, Afro-Latino, African immigrant, it matters not. It is imperative that you fill out the census and be sure to count every single person in your household, because every single person in your household is going to need resources in order to navigate life after COVID-19. We are so grateful and appreciative for all of the partners we've been able to work with, all of the wonderful work at the New York Immigration Coalition, Pastor Monroe, and it has been a wonderful effort up until this point. But it has been a necessary effort because the occupant in the White House does not want Black and brown communities to be counted. One of the best things you can do after voting, well, actually before voting considering the timeline, fill out your census, then go request your absentee ballot so that you can vote safely, be fully counted, and ensure that our schools in the next decade are fully funded, that our hospitals in the next decade are fully funded, that our senior citizens have access to what they need over the next 10 years. If you have gone to a New York City school over the past decade and your school was underfunded, I guarantee you part of that lack of funding was because our communities were not counted in the 2010 census. We cannot make that mistake again. Our lives are on the line. This pandemic has showed us one thing. Not that race matters, but racism matters. And if we are going to be effective at making sure we have all of the resources that we need for a full recovery during the next 10 years, you must be counted on the census. Thank you.
Thank you, Lurie. I'm going to take advantage of this moment as a daughter of a Haitian woman to say a couple of words in Creole. Renseignement est extrêmement important pour le Code fédéral, pour l'école, pour l'hôpital, pour l'assurance médicale, et pour tout peuple. Thank you. Now with that, I'm going to hand it over to my dear friend and colleague, Amy Torres, Director of Policy at the Chinese Planning Council. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Amy Torres, Director of Policy and Advocacy with CPC, the Chinese American Planning Council. I've come to several of these events with my friends and partners, and I'm somehow always after Lurie, which is incredibly difficult to follow, and not to mention the incredible remarks that so many have made before me. So I'd actually like to spend a bit of time addressing something that CPC has said since we started getting involved in census a couple years ago. And I know we've talked a lot about how publicly available data that's derived from the census has informed the pandemic response. We've talked about how it informs public school funding, how it informs our funding for public hospitals, all of our public infrastructure. And it's really important to continue to reiterate that point, that this is how we form emergency response and it's how it informs our access to resources and representation for the next 10 years. But when CPC started getting involved in census work a few years ago, we weren't just looking at what was at stake within the next 10 years, we were looking forward to the year 2050. 2050 is the year that the United States is slated to become a majority-minority population, meaning the majority of people in the United States will be made up of minority communities. If we're looking at how we want to best equip Asian American and Pacific Islander communities, low-income communities, and immigrant communities that CPC represents, we're not just looking to next year and redistricting, we're not just looking for the next 10 years, we're looking for how we best empower our community so that when we get to 2050, we're standing with our best foot forward. Larry mentioned our public schools. When CPC looks at Asian American and Pacific Islander communities, we know we're sitting at several intersections that prevent our communities from properly being counted. Living in multi-generational households, not being native English speakers, having children under 5 years old and being recent immigrants to this country. When you put all of those myriad things together, we're not just looking at a 5-year-old in 2020 who's going to be 15 by the year 2030. We're looking at what sort of public school will that child go to? How will their family be able to access affordable housing? How will they be taken care of in our public hospitals? But we're also looking still at that year 2050. In 2050, that child will now be 35 years old. Will they have all of the resources that they need to become the 35-year-old that's now eligible to run for president? If you want to be suspicious of the census, fine, be suspicious. But who you need to be suspicious of are the people who are intentionally trying to rip the rugs out from underneath our community, make sure that our children are the ones who aren't just able to thrive when they're 15 years old, but that are going to be at a disadvantage by 2050 when it's finally time for our communities to wield power. So we're thrilled to stand here with our partners. There's no better place for us to ground this fight than in Brooklyn, which is not only emblematic of our city's diversity, but also emblematic of how public policy with the right publicly available data can either support communities to thrive or can further drive us into structural and systemic racism. We're so pleased to be here. We're going to bring the same fight that we've brought over the last 2 years to the final few weeks and then through to November as well. Please visit my2020census.gov. You can fill it out in a myriad of different languages and also support over the phone. Thank you.
Thank you, Amy. And last but definitely not least, I'm pleased to introduce Juan Rosa, who is the Manager of Civic Engagement, Regional Director of Civic Engagement at NYIC Educational Fund.
All right. So I'm going to start in Spanish. Okay. So, estamos acá hoy en Brooklyn para hablar de la comunidad de Brooklyn, a los residentes de Brooklyn, que es seguro hacerse contar en el censo. Una falta de conteo de nuestra comunidad significa que va a haber menos recursos para las escuelas, para los hospitales, para el transporte. Tenemos que hacernos contar. Un 77% de la comunidad latina entiende que su participación en el censo ayuda a la comunidad, pero un 75% cree, lo tiene claro, que la administración del presidente Trump va a usar los datos del censo en su contra. Eso es, como dijo Lovely hace un rato, totalmente falso. La información del censo está protegida por el título 13 del Código Penal de los Estados Unidos. Ni Lisa Moore, ni Luis, ni ningún oficial del censo puede romper el secreto del censo. Se enfrentan a 5 años de cárcel y una multa de $250,000. O sea, que el censo es necesario para los recursos, necesario para el poder político, que lo vamos a necesitar para salir de esta crisis económica y de sanidad que tenemos en nuestra ciudad y en nuestro país, pero también es totalmente seguro y confidencial. Y como dijo Amit Baga, nunca se ha roto el secreto del censo desde que fue establecido en el 1953. Nunca se ha roto hasta el día de hoy. En este país es un país de leyes, de derecho. La administración tendría que ir a la corte a romper ese secreto y hasta hoy en día nunca se ha roto. Entonces en Brooklyn tenemos una tarea un poquito ardua hasta el final del censo. En comunidades especialmente latinas como en Bushwick tenemos un 45.6% de respuesta. En East New York un 38.7%, en Red Hook 49.5%, en Sunset Park 46.3. Quiere decir que los vecindarios con mayoría latina, con mucha comunidad latina, no están respondiendo al nivel que deben responder. Es necesario que sepan que no solamente es el gobierno que no tiene acceso a su respuesta, también es el casero, también es NYIC, también es a la persona que usted le renta un cuarto que tiene sección 8. Nadie tiene acceso a su respuesta y usted no necesita esperar que nadie vaya a su casa ni que le llegue nada a la casa. Puede ir a mi census2020.gov, mi 2020 census.gov, o llamar totalmente en español al 844-468-2020 para hacer su respuesta. I said it in Spanish. I'm going to just paraphrase a little bit because we all spoke English. We have an arduous task in Brooklyn. Some of the Latino heavy neighborhood in this borough are struggling. We have Bushwick with 45.6% response rate, East New York 38.7%, Red Hook 49.5%, Sunset Park 46.3%. That means that we do need to do more work in the Latino communities to make sure that we are counted. Now, Leo understands that there's apprehension in the Latino community. 77% of Latinos understand that the communities benefit when they participate in the census. Yet, 75% of those same people that were surveyed say that they know that the Trump administration will use that data against their community. Okay? So we have the dichotomy. 77% understand that it's important, but 75% think that that data is going to be used against them. And like Lovely said, and Amit said, and Lisa said, it is false. There is no access to anyone outside of the Census Bureau to the data that you share. Not your landlord, not the lady who you rent a room from, not NYCHA, not HRA for your benefits, not HRA again for SNAP. No one has access to your data. We want to know how many people live in this country every 10 years to go ahead and reapportion political power among the states, and later to use that data for benefits that we need every 10 years. So with that, I want to say Brooklyn, make yourself count. I cannot do Brooklyn, make yourself count. Gracias, thank you.
So to summarize key points, the census is about money, trillions of dollars of federal funding allocated to states based on census data, power, the amount of representatives we will have in Washington, D.C. fighting for New York, respect. New Yorkers deserve to be counted and to display the full richness and diversity of who they are. It is safe, it is confidential, it is easy, it is important. Everyone needs to fill it out at my2020census.gov or call at 844-330-2020. Most importantly, if you have filled it out, your job is not done. Now you go and you find your friends and your family and your colleagues and your neighbors and your pastor, and you ask them to fill it out. And then you ask them to ask everyone else to fill it out. And for more information on how to do that, you can go to newyorkcounts2020.org. Any questions? Pardon? Do you have a copy of the ID?
Oh no, we don't have an ID that we share. Yeah, we don't.
They don't want it to be, yeah.
Coverage. Yeah. We don't want, the reason why is we don't want any false IDs being pre-printed across the region and then scams occurring, because scams will occur and have occurred. And an authentic ID would have. Sorry. I've been out of practice. An authentic ID would have a watermark on it and an expiration date and a photo and a picture of the individual with their full name. So if that's what they would need to be showing at the door. So they would show it, they ring the doorbell, knock on the door, they show that ID, they step 6 feet back, and then explain to them hi, I'm Lisa Moore, I'm with the Census Bureau, and I'm here to conduct the 2020 census.
Sure. New York Immigration Coalition is a plaintiff in the lawsuit which has to do with the administration's policy of excluded undocumented immigrants for the purposes of apportionment from the numbers that are used to determine how many representatives we get. There is a separate lawsuit taking place in California that we are not part of, which is the one you're referring to, which is the one that's talking about the deadline being brought forward to September 30th. As of right now, the Census Bureau has been told that it cannot do any wind down operations. It cannot continue to prepare to stop operations on September 30th. I think everyone's guess is as good as everyone else's. As with most things with this administration, this is a case of the first impression. No one really knows where this is going to go. What I will say is that for this to truly be successful, we need Congress to pass legislation extending the statutory deadlines for when census data needs to be delivered. Without that, the administration is going to be able to say, well, we have deadlines to meet. And without that, the Supreme Court is going to be able to say, Congress has the full right and ability to extend the deadline, so what are we going to do if they don't do that? So really, if people want to do something else to help the census, then they need to be on the phone and writing letters to their senators and their representatives to say, we need to pass legislation to make sure that the census is extended accordingly and the deadlines to reflect that. Sure. Okay, so what is not on the census? No immigration question, no citizenship question, no social security number, no information about finances, bank accounts, political parties. It is really simple, basic demographic data like your name, your age, your race, your ethnicity. Do you rent or own? Did I say how old you are? Yeah. So really basic stuff. Once it starts feeling like this is something someone could use to commit fraud on you, then you know that's not a census question. Lurie just said you give more information to Facebook than you do to the census. You also give more information to Amazon and Google just by walking around. Any other questions? All right, thank you very much. I'd like to thank all of my colleagues. Thank you so much, Deputy Borough President. And yeah. Hold on. Queens counts. 100%. Manhattan counts. 100%. Bronx counts. 100%. Staten Island counts. 100%. And finally, Brooklyn counts. 100%. All right, thank you, everyone.